I'm Russell, and welcome to this week's Renewables Roundup podcast. This week, I'm really pleased to be joined once again by Kenny Schoolcraft. Kenny and I are going to talk about the role of BESS in the US market. But right now, I've got a burning question. Is it tomato or is it tomato? Let's find out. Hey Kenny, thanks for joining me again this week. How are you doing?
Good, Russ. Appreciate you having me back.
I'm looking forward to it. I know we kept this fairly casual this week, but I thought we could have a chat around BESS. How do you feel about that?
I think it's pretty timely, right? We're fielding a lot of questions from developers in particular, but also corporates around BES, and so happy to chat.
I love it. I think the way I characterize it is, and I have to dig back now. I'm kind of looking and think, but if I go back 12 years, there was this point in Europe on the corporate PPA market when there was a lot of buzz and talk about corporate PPAs, a bit like there is now with BES. Everyone was talking about it, and there were some people who were saying, "Let's throw in behind it." Other people saying, "Oh, it's a trend and it's a fad, whatever." And obviously, look at what it became, and I feel like BES is moving past that kind of inflection point of that kind of buzz. Um, so that's me talking a bit randomly, but where do you think BES is today in the US?
It's certainly a growing trend, right? I mean, storage, so just BES, right? We talk, it's battery storage, right? So battery storage is, increasingly becoming like the glue that makes high renewable grids workable by shifting solar and wind into like the evening peak periods and providing sort of fast response reliability services. So it's kind of serving multiple purposes in that regards. We're seeing peak shift later into the day where solar doesn't provide as much value, and then obviously you have the reliability piece of the grid where you can call on the batteries. So um, I think in 2025, the US has installed about 60 gigawatt hours of new battery storage, which is about, say, 30% above 2024 levels and about four times what 2022 was. So
Wow.
obviously, it's scaling up pretty dramatically. So utility scale storage, I think in total, maybe 140 gigawatt hours in 2025, but it's expected to exceed 600 gigawatt hours by 2030. So, again, a 4 or 5 times increase from where we are today. So that basically makes batteries a core grid infrastructure, not a niche technology that it was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Um, and we're seeing, states like Illinois and Michigan passing legislation to mandate increases in the deployment
Mm.
batteries with renewables. And then you have utility level integrated resource plans that are also increasing the amount of BESS. So even though there's not a federal level mandate, states and individual utilities are basically saying, we want batteries.
Yeah, I think it's come at a time when you're right. There is a need. I like the fact it's a glue that holds the low carbon grid together. So there's a definite need, and I think what I've sort of seen I did some research earlier on with into batteries, and um, the cost of batteries have fallen rapidly, and I think that's been as the technology has been developed and there's been more investment in it and scaling of it, particularly in China, but I think in lots of other places now, you know battery costs really have tumbled. But of course it's not just grid scale batteries, because we're using batteries in EVs and in hundreds of places, and obviously listeners can't see me waving my phone around, but there's even a battery in this thing, and so that technology has constantly improved and constantly got cheaper. So what we've got is a really good storm of somewhere where it fits and it works really well when there's money to be had, and a falling price, should we say, for deployment, which I guess makes sense of why you would turn to batteries rather than saying, oh well, we need to build diesel plant or gas plant because that's not low carbon, or pumped storage or anything else because it's quicker and easier to deploy and it just works.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the falling cost helps helps the case for batteries. Now, how low can that go? It's still a premium to a typical, straight renewable that you put on the grid, but obviously there are benefits to the grid, right? Now, are there benefits to corporates? That's sort of another piece of the conversation we can get into, but certainly for the grid itself and reliability, batteries make sense, and the
Yeah.
cost certainly is going down.
Absolutely, and you're right. Let's hold those some of those thoughts because we can talk about, the white mass corporates and developers and all these kind of things, and yeah, the premium. I was looking earlier on at CAISO, where I kind of feel like that there's a lot of battery deployment, and I tried to look at the numbers, and the numbers were something like there's currently somewhere around 16 gigawatts of batteries deployed in CAISO. And I looked at Europe, and the estimate for Europe, I think I found, was 18 gigawatts. So just in that one ISO, there's the same amount of battery capacity. I mean, obviously, it's a large area, I get that, as in Europe. Great model. And I thought that's really interesting. And there's also a lot of growth in batteries in CAISO. It's a really good. I look at that and think, is that fair for me to say that CAISO could be a really good indicator of what's to come? And what would you think of CAISO as an example for how batteries have integrated into the grid?
So I think it's certainly the test case is probably the wrong word, but it's certainly the market that you would look at to see how this potentially could go for other regions, based on, consumption or legislative factors or things like that. So, in CAISO, it solves a really specific problem, right? There's a huge solar build out and very sharp evening ramps on the grid. So that's created basically what everyone refers to as a duck curve, right? Where basically the net load can swing by 20 gigawatts in 8 hours between late morning and the evening peak. So you need something flexible and that can be ramped up. And so batteries are basically those shock absorbers, right? They charge in the late morning, in the midday when the solar's flooding the system, and as a result, prices are low, right, or even negative, and then they discharge during the evening when prices are higher and the system's really tight. So it works as intended. That's valuable for the grid, and it's also a revenue generator for developers, right? Buy low, sell high, and get paid for providing flexibility and reserves. Um, and I think it's maybe in the teens as a percentage of CAISO's peak demand right now for key hours of sort of filling in that gap, which is a big change even from a few years ago. Now, again, CAISO has a couple of things working for it that make this happen. They've got really, California has really aggressive clean energy targets, right? 100% by 2045. And they need a lot more to even get there, right? And they also have a resource adequacy framework that really values that storage as a uh, dependable peak capacity, right? So not even deploying them, and just the fact that they're there.
Mm.
So you don't even necessarily need the arbitrage spread to get paid for it if you're a developer. So there's a lot of things, whether it's the weather there, the consumption there, the regulatory policies that work towards batteries being very beneficial. And whether that translates to other states or other markets, I think remains to be seen, but certainly being explored.
It's really interesting because it wasn't until I started researching that I kind of, that whole capacity thing, the being there, which I kind of realized, and I know I got, and and we see, but we've traditionally seen, should we say, from generating plant, I've got capacity if I need it. And it's interesting that the batteries are almost providing a zero carbon capacity, as well as smoothing the duck curve, as in arbitrage. So they charge in the day and they discharge at the peak. Um, you know, providing grid stability, frequency, and other ancillary services, which again I think is a sort of another benefit. Although again, I think from what I see that market is so much smaller than the kind of total market that you can use for batteries. It easily becomes saturated, but the grid operator's not going to complain about that because the prices are going to be lower, I guess. So
Yeah,
um,
I mean, like with anything else, and I'm trying to think of like another arbitrage opportunity that outside of energy that goes away. So for instance, 20 years ago, if you had something on eBay and you said, hey, this thing's very worth this, right? Like someone might go, oh, I'm going to buy that. But now there's a flood of information on the value of things. And so now you can't necessarily sell your, you know, whatever watch for a premium or what have you, right? Batteries have kind of done something similar from the standpoint of the more batteries you put on the grid, that arbitrage opportunity of buy low, sell high goes away. And you need to have some of those other functions like capacity payments or someone who wants, um, you know, hourly carbon-free supply to make the benefit, right,
mm.
or the use case of batteries. So we have to be careful about it's always going to be an arbitrage opportunity because that opportunity goes away the more batteries get put on the system.
So that's a really interesting. So we've lived through solar cannibalization, which is a very common theme. More solar's deployed, it pushes the hourly prices down because middle of the day. I've seen it in wind. The UK's got quite a lot of wind generation. On a windy day, the price is pushed down. Now we've got BESS cannibalization, battery cannibalization, which goes the other way. That says the arbitrage revenue will decrease the more volume of batteries you have. But what's really interesting is again, I looked at something, and this was the UK rather than the US, but to me it illustrated a great point. Looking at the shift in their revenue stack for a battery between say 2021 and 2025, it moved. There was a time when the sort of grid services were really valuable, and they were the largest part. Arbitrage wasn't so much, there wasn't very much going on. And then it shifted, and suddenly the arbitrage got to be a big chunk of it because there was more renewable deployment. The ancillary services market got a bit flooded. That element went away, and then in 2025, what should appear but tolling? Third parties coming along saying, "I'll take that battery and run it for my benefit because I think I know what I want." I want it to do. The point being is that not only are batteries flexible in terms of physically what they do, but the contracts, I guess, also need to be flexible because the sources of value are going to change over the life of that battery. But if you're plugged into it and you get it, then I guess you can take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does remain to be seen, depending on what's on the grid at any given time, of what those value props are, right? Ancillary services, capacity, the actual energy itself. But it does allow that flexibility. So that is certainly a
Yeah.
benefit over the long term.
It's interesting. So we've talked about why batteries matter, I think, for grids and for low carbon. Um, these days, I would say you can't talk to a developer without them wanting to talk about batteries and deploying batteries either on their own or with renewable projects. So I suppose my question is, why, in your view, do batteries matter for renewable developers?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the reasons that we just kind of discussed, right? It's no longer really a nice to have add-on. It's a way to um, accomplish a couple things. First, and well, I shouldn't say foremost, but like if you think about it from the concept of even getting the projects available, I think that the flexibility that they add make them more valuable through interconnection queues. So in a lot of markets where we have interconnection queues and wait times of, a year or 3 years of what's going to get prioritized, slapping a battery on a project makes it more attractive to a utility or an ISO, because of the less intermittency that it provides. So that's one benefit. You obviously have some benefit from the arbitrage, reduced curtailment risk, and stacking those multiple revenue streams, right? Whether it's the capacity payments, the ancillary services, what have you. So I think for all of those factors, it matters for developers getting a project operational. And this is also kind of made more compelling by the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave standalone storage access to the federal tax credits. So as long as that's there, that's certainly a positive for storage, and that's really sort of changed the financing conversation. So a lot of the projects that we're penciling as pure solar, maybe a couple of years ago, maybe are being redesigned as solar plus storage or standalone batteries, to help push these things across the goal line. So there's certainly incentives from the developer community to include BESS on projects in a lot of cases, especially if they're being pointed towards utilities.
I think that's a very fair point. I think my research and what I've heard, it supports that. In terms of project return and even just de-risking it, as in having some flexibility around the sources of revenue and the what might happen in the market. Having a hybrid project, solar and BESS or wind and BESS, is an improvement, if that makes any sense, in terms of the risk and the return. The other thing I've seen and heard, and I see what you think about this, is two things. One, I want to build my wind or solar project, but I'm struggling to get grid access because I can't get the full capacity I need. But putting in some battery storage means I don't quite need the full capacity that I might have needed otherwise, particularly for solar. Therefore, it's easy to get. And B, the other one I've seen is I want to build a data center, but I can't get access to the grid to power it. So therefore, renewable plus, local renewable plus storage almost on the same grid as me or even connected to my data center suddenly makes huge sense, because basically I don't need you network. And is that fair?
100%, right? And so we talked about how that's attractive to utilities, certainly for some large corporates, specifically data centers, and we're seeing this come to fruition in the market, right? Those batteries solve really three problems at once, right? Cost, carbon, and resiliency. So pairing the renewables with storage lets them hedge those peak prices. It keeps critical operations running if there were outages, right? And they can move beyond sort of the simple annual green energy claims to, like, you think of the hyperscalers of the world that are looking at doing 24/7 carbon-free supply. Those batteries fill that need too, right? And whether GHG protocol moves that direction or not still remains to be seen. But for some of the large players, right, that 24/7 is already a goal for them, and so those batteries fill that need because they can match clean power hour by hour to their load.
And I've seen some stunning deals because as battery storage durations are getting longer, either because of technology shifts or even different technologies. We talk about batteries, but other storage technologies. We've seen some projects announced, and it's kind of getting to the point where the overcapacity of solar, for example, plus huge battery storage means that actually you can begin to look at running quite large, facilities, as you said, on a 24/7 baseload operation, or at least stand a fighting chance of it. And that's a very different proposition to the way that I think the market, or to be anyone's ever thought about it before. It's always been, well, it's grid centric. You know, the average total matches the average total, generation matches demand, and that's how it is. And then suddenly we've got this localization.
Yeah, and I don't know if you see this in Europe. I think that sort of um, thing that you just described, again, is great for a very small subset of companies, maybe a large percent of incremental load. So does it solve the problem of, say, the way the grid and the load exists today? No. Does it help incremental large load? Yes. But then what do other corporates do? Like, how do they look at that? Are they willing to take on the incremental costs? So, even with battery prices going down or storage durations going up, right? It's still an incremental cost. And are most companies willing to take that on? That's really the question. Um, and I'm not so sure that they are. So I don't know. I've been on some calls with you, Russ. Curious to hear if you guys are seeing anything in Europe that leads you to believe that that's the case.
It's a really interesting question. I'm trying to figure out how I answer it. And I think the answer's in two parts. I think we do see interest, that is, corporates are willing to consider what a BESS, what a battery or what storage can do for a PPA, or what can it do for me? But so I think that's the first part. Is there interest? Yes. What can it do? What what's it going to deliver? What's it going to do to the goose? What's it going to do to the price? Because we talked about there being a premium, but actually, if I'm paying a price and a premium, but it's shaping my PPA, actually, when I look at the whole cost of it, that might be beneficial to me in some way. So it's not a simple, headline price is €10, €20 more. It could be that, well, the headline price is €10, €20 more, but actually it's shifting the value, because actually suddenly I'm getting some peak energy out of this solar. I'm not just getting bombarded with daytime energy, at low prices. So there is interest, but the problem is, ultimately, I think it comes down to, what does it do for me? Because unless you are, you talked about those very few cases. I've seen cases in the UK where there are manufacturing operations who are not working on like firm grid capacity. They're working on a grid connection, which could, in theory, be removed. Or they're working on constraints, and actually they might say, well, having some battery access on site could be helpful for us. Is it, if it goes in a PPA, does it matter? So to try and cut a long story short, I think people are I think corporates in EU are really interested in what a battery might do, but there's no guarantee they'll take one, because they're going to look at that and say, how does it fit with my financial and ESG goals? If it's better than a standalone PPA, then that's great. If it's not, then it, that the battery's not the driver for me. It's the end goal, the delivered energy.
Yeah, and that's really what we're encouraging developers, right, to think about is, tell us come up with the value prop that resonates with a typical corporate, because especially in an environment where, again, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, the arbitrage opportunities may not be there to the extent that they were before, right? You may not see, you know, really extreme price spikes over an extended period of time to pay these things back, right? And it's just another level of complexity in an already complex, let's say, PPA contract that corporates have a hard time sort of wrapping their head around, right? There's already forecast out there of how this thing's going to model out. And now we've got to consider how these battery opportunities may or may not come to fruition. And it doesn't really help us in our sustainability goals or claims in a lot of cases. So, I just don't think we're there yet, right? Where those sorts of battery hybrid projects make sense for the majority of the corporates. But we're hopeful, right, that that's the case at some point. And it's really going to be, developer to developer on kind of how they make those cases. Now, I will say that those opportunities, right, are different depending on different ISOs and different nodes. So if you think about, pricing at the node level, right, where there could be more constraint on the grid, maybe there's a more powerful story that's very location specific to a project, right, that a developer can call out. So you can't just say, I've got a hybrid solution in MISO, and this is going to be great for you. But if a corporate is saying, I'm looking for something in a specific area, and so putting the battery on it potentially leads to this outcome, right? That's the story that could be told.
Yeah, and I think there's a good point in there about the sort of complexity and the risk, be it real or perceived. And I think it can be real that corporates face, because ultimately, even the most energy intensive corporates, they're going to have, they have teams and experienced buyers and everything, but ultimately it's not their sole focus. Their sole focus might be the production and the sale of aluminium or steel, or being a data
You meant
center.
to say aluminum. You meant to say aluminum.
I meant
not
to say aluminum. I do
right?
apologize.
Okay.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. And so ultimately, the energy, even if it's a big part, it's not everything. And simplicity, I think you're right, is simplicity matters, and I think it is the right message for developers, because we've seen, I think, in the EU, some head scratching and some maybe tentative offers, and maybe more offers where they're like, well, we could do something with a battery if you want it. We're now seeing firmer structures, more defined, clearly structures that maybe have been analyzed, tested, refined more, more clear offers. Some of them are more simple than others. And again, I think then the corporates can look at them and say, right, I can see exactly what it is, and we can see the risk and we can understand it. Because I think otherwise it just becomes a barrier if it's not, if it's overly complex or it's not fully defined. I suspect it just becomes one of those things that the corporate looks like and goes, I've got enough on looking at PPA. I'm not sure this is going to work. And if someone else has got something simpler and well defined, it might just be easier to accept, particularly, as you said, if it can be pitched in a way that the corporate says, yeah, I can see the benefit. Yeah, it de-risks my PPA, or actually it's going to reduce the net cost to me. So I think that's where we're beginning to see some traction in those offers.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So okay, we've talked quite a lot. I think. How about one last question then? Where do you think the battery market goes from here today? Do you think it's going to grow or change? Is it plateau? Where do you think it's going to
go? I mean, I certainly think that it's going to continue to grow, right? I think that if you look at most credible outlooks, you're talking about the U.S. getting to 600 gigawatt hours of installed storage by 2030, right? Which is several times over where we are today. So I don't blame developers for wanting to continue down this path, and I think it's a worthwhile process. It'll be a core part of how we plan and operate the grid, right? The grid as a whole. So there's growth there, right? I think the next chapter really is the focus about not so many how many megawatts we can build, but like where does that storage create the most value and how do we contract it, right? So from a developer standpoint, again, those specific projects that maybe are in areas where there's higher volatility in pricing, and in the foreseeable future will continue to be that way, right? Those congestion pinch points, putting those batteries around big new loads like data centers or EV manufacturing, right? more deliberately for capacity and reserves, things that we talked about from those revenue streams coming in. So I think it's just going to be more strategic as the growth continues and not necessarily all about the arbitrage. And I think that the contract structures will keep evolving too, right? So is it going to be a tolling style agreement? Is it going to be a revenue share model? Is it going to be a firmed and shaped product for corporates that want something closer to, clean dispatchable resources, right? And so I think as long as the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits are still there, we'll see that sort of pivot into more strategy in deployment, but the growth certainly will continue. That's my opinion. I don't know
I
if you
like it.
share that, but
No, I agree. I think it will grow globally. I think it will grow until it plateaus, and that plateau will be driven by essentially the need for the market. Because as we discussed earlier on, I think you've got battery cannibalization. So there becomes a point where you just don't need the impetus, the need, and the should we say even just the arbitrage value, and some of the other markets. Those values will decrease to the point where it's like, okay, the next marginal battery is not, the case isn't so good. I do think it will grow till it plateaus. I think the revenue streams will shift because I think the capacity element is really important. It's not necessarily that it's there doing stuff all the time. It needs to be there when you need it. And I think that will change. And therefore, coming back to what you said right at the beginning, when you talked about utilities and grid operators, I still think they are going to be crucial in the market. And the reason I think about that is because they're not going to want, their responsibility is for maintaining and operating the grids. They're not going to want the battery community almost to be like the Wild West, just doing what they want. So as battery deployment increases, they're going to have to look at their policies and their procedures and their regulation to make sure that they're integrated. Because left to their own devices, the batteries probably would do a reasonably good job of keeping things where they needed to be, but they need to be controlled to get it exactly right, which is what we need it to be. So I think that space will be really interesting because I think we will see more battery deployment in the US and we'll see it in EU. And I can see a point in the future where, batteries are part of the fabric of the energy system. I think a lot of the revenue potentially will be around capacity. I think the actual energy that flows in and out will become a lesser part. So it's almost like we need them there, just doing their job. That's what we'll pay for. Almost, dare I say, almost the same as having wires and pylons and transformers. They're part of the infrastructure.
Yeah, and Europe is completely different from the U.S. from the perspective of, right, our marginal fuel source is natural gas. We're flush with natural gas, and there's not, yes, there's short-term variability on we get a cold snap and price spikes on the prompt month of NYMEX natural gas, but you guys have a lot higher gas prices than we do. You have a lot more renewables on a percentage basis being deployed. I would almost think that batteries in that case make a lot more sense in Europe than they do in the US because you're competing against a higher cost marginal fuel source and you're having a larger percentage of your total load being served by intermittent resources. And
Yeah, I
so
think
I
that's
wouldn't be surprised if batteries take off in Europe as a percentage more than in the US. I could be wrong on that. It's just something I was thinking of right when you were talking there. But
no, it's an interesting one. Yeah, gas prices are high, but I think that's because we buy a lot of our LNG from the US now. So I think you guys have
yeah,
figured us out.
we're gonna
But
squeeze you now. Yeah.
yeah, that's good. You've got us. The first one was free, but now you've got us, and that's fine. No, and I think you're right. And I look at places like Spain and I look at CAISO and I think, is CAISO the model for where Spain's going to get to and things like that. I look at the deployment in the UK and you see things like, the ancillary services market revenues crashed, but all the battery operators have. I think there's a lot to learn. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. But I still think ultimately it'll get to this almost infrastructural part because it just, that's why we need them. Um, Well, that's been brilliant. Thank you very much for once again agreeing to answer my random questions, Kenny.
No, it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it anytime.
That's good. I'm sure it's interested, and of course, if anyone's got any questions about anything we've discussed today, or they want to know more, you can reach out to Kenny, reach out to me, and I'm sure we're happy to help. So yeah, just once again, thanks for joining me, and have a fabulous rest of your week.
You too, Russ. Good talking.